Sometimes my anger or my fierceness is coming from very deep compassion, and sometimes it's coming from fear in my personality. See, like all anger, there is what's called dharmic anger, where the Zen monk beats the hell out of his student just out of unbearable love for him. It's true, you see, and it's interesting. And you've got to, now what I used to do was when people would say, "What are you getting so angry?" I'd say, "Well, it's out of my compassion," but it was baloney. It was really out of my fear. Okay? And now I'm willing to see that it's both. And that sometimes I am very fierce with somebody because I love them so much, and it's the only way it's going to cut through. And they're asking me to do that. And other times it's just because I'm scared and because my ego is very vulnerable. And you've got to know in your heart which it is, because I don't necessarily know either. See, we're dealing with this kind of liquid space in which we're all human and at the same moment divine, and we're going in and out of these planes all the time. There's no one technique. You may watch sometimes that when somebody asks me something, I'm sort of quiet for a while. People always wonder whether I'm brain damaged or something, but really, and what I'm doing is I'm emptying. I'm just emptying and waiting to hear what happens next. And sometimes you can facilitate that emptying by just following your breath. Because if you bring your awareness to your breath, you can't be thinking about the things you were busy thinking about. There are many, many beings that are available to us to guide us and help us. And it has to do with our receptivity to these beings. And that has to do with our level of involvement. And there's nothing you can force in this situation. You just keep working on yourself to be quieter, to be able to hear. Because as long as your mind is too attached, it's like you're tuning out a lot of frequencies or tuning out a lot of channels where that information is available. And as you quiet down, you are able to receive a lot of stuff that's available to help you, but most of the time you're just rejecting it. I think the messages are all available. There may come a time when we're able to receive them. Yes, I think we're learning a certain kind of humility and a certain kind of quietness that may allow us to receive more. I have experienced the dolphins giving me very deep teachings about intuition, trusting my intuition. You want the story? I got to tell it. You got to wait. I got to tell the dolphin story. Those of you that have heard the dolphin story, just bear with it. I have these friends, John and Tony Lilly, who've done a lot of work with dolphins and written books and so on. And they invited me to swim with the dolphins, two dolphins named Joe and Rosie, that were at, I don't know, it's called Marine World or something like that, up in Redwood City, California, where they were doing some research with the dolphins. And I came up there on a kind of a cold, gray day with a friend of mine. And we didn't have wetsuits, and we put our bathing suits, and my friend was in the tank, went in the tank and was with the dolphins, and I got in on the holding platform in the water, but still standing, and then I got into the water where I was treading water. And my first thought was, you're supposed to want to swim with the dolphins. When they said, you want to swim with the dolphins? I said, of course. And now that I was swimming the dolphins, I thought, what am I doing here? Here, suddenly it's cold and gray, and I don't want to be in the water, and who are these fish? And, it was that kind of place of, I think I've made a mistake. And everybody was watching to see what Ram Dass did with the dolphins. So whatever I did, I had a smile. That was very clear that I had to keep my game going properly. So I was just waiting and treading water. And the first thing that happened was that Joe and Rosie went by me very, very close, very fast. They made passes at me. And I realized that they were very powerful and very strong, and this was their territory. And it didn't make me feel any more comfortable. And I kept thinking, what are you supposed to do with dolphins? That was the thought in my mind, you know. It's like, here, dolphin, dolphin. It was that kind of, like, I'm sure it's something you're supposed to do to get this great, wise teaching. And at that point, Joe came over, and he opened his mouth, and he put it around my wrist. And as that mouth went around my wrist, like every Jaws fantasy I'd ever had, and I saw the hand, you know, falling to the bottom, and because that somehow you can say dolphin, dolphin, but when that hand, mouth goes around your wrist, and he just very gently pulled me out into the middle of the tank to play with him. I mean, he just pulled me out and let go. Now, there's nothing in my model about things with tails that they come along and take you by the wrist gently for loving purposes. And what happened was he blew my mind. I mean, my rational mind couldn't handle what he had just done to me. And so that let me let go of my rational mind, because I was busy thinking, what do you do with dolphins? And whatever I had as modeled dolphins didn't have that in it. That loving action opened me. He opened me at that moment. And I just sort of sat there in a kind of just confusion or just waiting. And at that moment, Rosie was right here. And she just hanging in there. And I reached out to touch her, assuming she would, usually when you touch something in the water, it swims away, or unless you go very slow. And I touched her, expecting her to pull back, and she stayed right there. And I began to feel how incredibly soft her skin was, because it's made up of a large amount of water. It's very porous. And I started to stroke her, and it just felt so good. And she stayed right in there as I stroked her. And the intimacy was opening my heart further. And I'd say it wasn't 15 seconds before Rosie was upright with her belly pressed against my belly, my arms around her fins around me. I was kissing her on the mouth, saying, "Oh, Rosie, I love you so much. Oh, Rosie, you're so beautiful." She was so delicious. It was just like, it was an immediate love affair. And so then after a little while of that, she swam around and was hanging in right here, and I thought what I'd like to do was swim with Rosie. And so I took her back fin, but I felt that I might break it. I was afraid of holding very tight because it felt brittle, you know, and I didn't know. So I held it, and she swam down under the water, and the minute she did, my hand slipped off, and I came back to the surface. She came up, and I took her top fin again and swam down, and my hand slipped off, and I came back to the surface. This happened 3 or 4 times, until finally I thought, gee, what I really have to do is grab the upper fin and hold her under the belly to hold on. But that's pretty presumptuous. I mean, that's coming on pretty strong, and I don't think that Rosie's going to like that too much. It's my mind. So I hold the back fin, and I put my hand under the belly, and she starts to swim wildly down below, and I think, oh, I'm bugging her. So I let go, and I float to the surface, and as soon as I get to the surface, she's right under my arm again. She's training me to trust, to let go, and to be with her, rather than all this mind stuff of she won't like it and all that. Okay, Rosie. I mean, she's very patient. She's waiting for me to get over my mind trips. So I grabbed her by the fin and put my hand under her and held on tight, and we started this wild swimming all over the tank. And at some point I thought, well, Rosie, this is wonderful, but I'm a human. I got to breathe, you know, and sooner than you do. The minute I felt the need for breath, she was on the surface waiting for me. And I took a breath and went down again and was swimming around. And every time I felt the need of a breath, Rosie came back to the surface. And at one point, we were up on the surface, and people were snapping pictures of me and Rosie. And I got into hamming it up a bit, and I forgot to take a breath. And she went down again, and I thought, well, Rosie, here's where we come to the parting of the ways. because you're probably on a 30-second cycle or something, you know. And the minute I felt that, she came right to the surface. It couldn't have been 3 or 4 seconds. Waited for me to get a breath, went down again. And after about 40 minutes, we were just swimming around very wildly. And it was just everything you dream it would be. It was. And at that point, I was shaking with cold and with fatigue, but I wouldn't let go. It was so good. I didn't want to stop, but I experienced a wave of fatigue at one moment, which I was going to ignore. But Rosie didn't ignore it. She came to the surface, shook me off, went around the tank once, picked up Joe. They came over, they both put their noses against my belly, pushed me over to the holding platform, out of the tank, wouldn't let me back into the tank for the rest of the afternoon, played with my friend, but not with me anymore. They'd play with me from the edge, but they wouldn't let me in the tank. Every time I tried to go in, they'd push me out again. And I experienced that I was connected to a being of very, very profound presence and isness, and a very compassionate quality of being. And I have any understanding about evolution or what Rosie has to go through or anything about that. And I don't necessarily think Rosie is wiser than I am, but I think Rosie is more connected to the way of things. But a rock is connected to the way of things, a tree is, a river is. But there was a quality of heart in that space, too, that I felt very humbled by. And I felt like I was receiving the teaching just by this process. And I came away very, very deeply touched in the sense that I had made a contact across species that was at a very profound level of truth. Very profound level of truth. And it's interesting because John is busy using television screens and underwater sound systems and all, to get the dolphins to speak in our language to help us. And I see that really, and Emmanuel said the same thing. Emmanuel said, really, the work with dolphins is to listen and learn their language rather than to get ours. And towards that end, I mentioned yesterday at lunch, we have an organization called the Human Dolphin Foundation, which is setting up a project south of Puerto Vallarta in Mexico, in which women with babies will spend a lot of time in the water with the dolphins so that the babies can develop a communication with the dolphins. Because once we have developed our conceptual frameworks, it's very hard to unlearn them, but a baby is in a much more intuitive position, and we think that just like that there's a whole other level of dialogue that can go on. We can learn a lot more that way. Joe was with my friend, mostly my relation with Rosie. Yeah. And Joe was at times a little jealous of my relation with Rosie. He would sometimes swim between us, but nothing very strong, just, dropped in to check out to make sure I wasn't copying his chick. Yes. Good. It's a good issue. It's a good issue. And I think that within your role within the psychiatric community, your contract in that community is to help those people function on this plane. But in terms of honoring spirit, it doesn't mean that you can't acknowledge and recognize that other stuff. And to say to somebody, sure, indeed, you may be being contacted, but our business together has to do with this plane. Right? And then at other times you can be with them in these other spaces. I meet many people who are experiencing many, many other messages and planes. And some of that, just as I've said before, just because somebody doesn't have a body doesn't mean they know anything more than you know, or that they're any wiser. I mean, there are a lot of disembodied beings that are well-meaning, but they're very stupid. And people somehow think that just because somebody's disembodied, they're all wise, and that isn't true necessarily at all. So you've got to listen. And a lot of the beings that people play with are really people that they're attracting by their own desire systems for this or that. I mean, they can play with dark forces or with sexual forces or with power forces and so on. So it's really a projection outward of the personality. It's not just projection, but that's the way they select who they meet and who they hang out with. I think that as you work on yourself more, you begin to see that some people are going to find guides very useful on other planes and can grow from them. And you can honor that right for people to do that. But that doesn't necessarily, you've got to not get confused with your function or your role in that setting. And it's interesting, for example, like a doctor who works at healing people and at the same moment can allow people to die. It's roughly the same thing. That you're there to help people, quote, whatever they mean, reality test, means relative reality test, but means learn this reality plane. At the same moment, you can honor this other space. And it's just an art form. You learn how to do that.